Welcome to Reach's November 2023 edition of Coffee and Conversations. I have a very exciting guest with us today, Justin Show. Justin, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah, great to see you. You're our first guest who has who's an adolescent or young adult. Now you're obviously an adult with HD, and I think it's a great opportunity for our audience and our community to learn about your experiences. So glad to have you. Where are you joining us from today?
Yeah, I'm in the Baltimore area because I go to school at Johns Hopkins, but yeah, Baltimore right now.
Great. For all the attendees here, it's November 17th. I'm sure everybody's gearing up for the Thanksgiving holiday. We're going to use the chat feature in the webinar to allow you guys to post questions. I'm going to kick us off with a few to get us started, but please, this like other coffee and conversations is really about getting your questions answered. My name is Eric Schnadig. I'm a co-founder of Reach, and I'll kick it off, Justin, with asking you to just tell us a little bit about what you're up to in Baltimore. What's your current sort of status? Are you in school? Are you a professional? What kind of career trajectory are you on?
Yeah, sounds good. Right now, I'm a second-year PhD student in biomedical engineering at Johns Hopkins, and so I'm mostly doing research right now. And the research that I'm working on is using these computational tools to build these personal virtual hearts for patients with congenital heart disease, and trying to identify ways that we can better devise treatments through using these specialized personal methods to identify the differences between each patient for congenital heart disease. Yeah.
That sounds amazing. How'd you get into this field?
Yeah, I think it's probably a pretty long story. But I did my undergraduate degree in biomedical engineering at UCLA, and I graduated in 2021. But I think prior to the reason I chose biomedical engineering in the first place was because I've always had an interest in science and medicine, and that interest in science and medicine has always been rooted in my background in living with Hirschsprungs disease. And from my own experience, I know the impact that these scientific methods and these technological tools in medicine, how they can help people like they did help me. So I kind of want to contribute to that, and especially help be a factor in like pushing that field in other forms of congenital disease as well.
That's pretty inspiring, Justin. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience of Hirschsprung disease, maybe starting from your earliest memories, and bring us forward and talk to us a little bit about your experience of that. I'm sure we'll be able to take that in a lot of directions.
Yeah, sounds good. I think the first thing I probably want to emphasize is like, I am definitely only one person. I definitely don't speak for everyone with Hirschsprung's disease, because it's definitely, a very wide spectrum. So I was born with short segment Hirschsprung's disease, and I was diagnosed when, I was only a few days old, I believe. And I had my operation that, saved my life when I was about a month old, I think. But the consequence of that was just like going to the bathroom constantly, from 5 to 10 to maybe more times a day for like the first 10 to 12 years of my life. And I, taking that with me through like growing up through elementary school and middle school, and just dealing with the consequences of, having to, manage that in a school setting. I think, yeah, I think like the one thing that definitely helped me the most was around when I was like 12 years old or 11 to 12 years old. I had biometric feedback therapy, which significantly helped me control my symptoms and control my condition. And as I got older into high school and college, I progressively got better and better to the point where now I think I mean, I still go to the bathroom more than like the average person, but in terms of like the control I have over my life, it doesn't dominate my life anymore. And, you know, I like, for most people who interact with me, they would, you know, see me as a completely ordinary person without any condition, which, you know, I think is not like, that's a common story for a lot of people with Hirschsprungs disease.
Let me take you in a couple different directions, if I might. First, you know, when you have a congenital disease, oftentimes the normal for you is living with the disease. So when you were a kid, going to the bathroom with frequency, was that something that you were just, it was obviously part of your life, but how did you sort of think about that, if you did at all?
Yeah, definitely. I think also the way parents deal with their kids' condition and communicate their kids' condition to them is also very different. So speaking from my experience, and this might be, you know, a cultural thing as well, my parents didn't really communicate the fact that I had Hirschsprungs disease to me until, or they never really explicitly actually, you know, told me that, you know, I had a congenital condition. And like from what I've seen of other people, I know that it's not an uncommon story that these kids with Hirschsprungs disease, when they're like 19 or 20, they grow up and they start looking online about the things they've gone through, and they suddenly realize, oh, this is something they have, and there's, you know, a community out there, you know, that has things like that. And that's kind of what I experienced. I didn't really process the fact that I had Hirschsprungs disease and that there was a community of people out there until like I was 18 years old, probably. But yeah, so just the fact of when I was a kid growing up with Hirschsprungs disease, I definitely understood that I was different in that most people did not have this, you know, constant bathroom struggle. But in terms of how I processed it, I kind of processed it as, you know, I either like didn't really think about it, or I, you know, treated myself as a normal kid, but then just had this thing that I was dealing with that was just an everyday occurrence. And I think for most kids, because if that's just their everyday, it's not going to, you know, it's definitely going to be processed very differently from someone who's perhaps like an adult and then suddenly starts experiencing symptoms and they have something to compare it to. But as a kid, you know, this was just my normal everyday experience, and I just became very familiar with it.
It's interesting, your parents' decision to sort of treat you as a normal kid. But how did you, like, you had surgery. How did you sort of experience your own scars in the area of the abdomen? What kind of surely you had questions.
Yeah, I mean, I did have questions. I guess, to be honest, I think I never really asked about it. I just knew that I was going through it. And I never really asked, why is this happening to me? I kind of just dealt with it. And I think that, like, kids are extremely resilient in the fact that whatever circumstances they have, they're just gonna, you know, deal with it in the best way that they see like possible. So in my circumstance, that was just, this thing is happening to me all the time. But what is the best way that I can deal with it? I can hide it. I can, you know, push it away and make it seem normal. And I think also for my circumstance, I'm lucky enough that I have short segment Hirschsprungs disease. I don't have like total colonic or long segment Hirschsprungs disease. So hiding it was actually feasible for me, whereas some other kids with Hirschsprungs disease, that's not even an option, right? So for my parents, and also I think like if there's any sort of cultural disconnect, like for Asian culture, it's actually quite common, or like there's some stigma around like the idea, or if you publicize the idea that there's something wrong, like obviously not wrong, but like something different about your child. So I think my parents wanted to protect me from that, and they didn't want me to think that I was different. So they just, didn't really talk about it. They dealt with the circumstances. They, you know, we like communicated about what was happening, but not really why what was happening was going on, and things like that.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating on that. That's great, Justin. You mentioned biometric feedback, and the therapy there. Before talking to you, I wasn't familiar with what that was because our son Adrian didn't go through that.
Yeah.
Maybe you could explain for the audience what that is and how you experienced that.
Yeah, I think like my experience on Hirschsprungs disease is like mostly like the psychosocial experience, but like logistically, a lot of my parents dealt with, the logistics of like dealing with medical admission and things like that. But in terms of my advice for parents, I think this is like the one concrete thing that I can definitely offer. So, growing up with short segment Hirschsprungs disease, like the mechanisms for me to go to the bathroom like properly were there, but as I grew up and I developed, I just like the neural processing what like I never learned how to use it. So from like when I was a very young child to up to like when I had the biometric feedback therapy, when I would go to the bathroom, I didn't know how to clench or push. So it might have been a side effect of just having to go to the bathroom all the time that I just never developed, that feeling. But like, so I would vividly remember like as a child, I would be on the toilet for like an hour or like read a book or something because I wouldn't know how to like push, the stool out. Right. I would just sit there and then my legs would fall asleep and I'd like finish a whole book or something like that. And and so I think
some people without Hirschsprung do that. Justin.
Well, yeah. Yeah. That doesn't happen anymore, maybe because of biometric feedback therapy. But so I think as I was getting older, like so in these school situations, I didn't know how to like I would feel the need to like go to the bathroom, but I wouldn't know how to fight against it. I would just be like, oh no, it's happening again. And I would try to fight against it, but I didn't have the mechanism to fight against it because it's just wasn't processing. So I think for my parents, and I can also go into like how I arrived at biometric feedback therapy. So I didn't go through biometric feedback therapy until I was older because I think for my parents, it's not out of the ordinary for Hirschsprungs disease kids to, have these, after effects from surgery, like as a young child, but they will probably grow out of it, right? That's kind of the advice that they have. So up to like, I was like 7 or 8, these events were still occurring, but, like my parents were, not too worried about it. And in terms of my academic performance, social performance, and things like that, there was no problem. Like I definitely had a lot of friends. I was getting good grades and things like that. But these things were still happening. Like I was still having accidents in school and things like that. So as I got older and older and older, and it was still happening, my parents definitely started questioning like what was going on. So when I was like 11 years old, I think I also had some instances of like rectal prolapse, which if you're not aware of what that is, it's like I'd be sitting on the toilet for so long and like I would be kind of pushing, but not really pushing because I didn't know how to. And then it's like, I think the like tip of your anus can like escape the sphincter, right? And that was like very concerning for my parents, even though it's, not necessarily super dangerous. So then after a couple of trips to the doctor, I was recommended biometric feedback therapy to test if I had the mechanisms to actually, like I was actually properly like using my bowel correctly. So in like this, the early stages of this biometric feedback therapy, before they do the therapy, they test your bowel control. So they'll like they'll stick electrodes on the child and they'll say, okay, now push as if you're trying to like push out your stool, and then now hold it as if you're trying to, not go to the bathroom and things like that. And it turns out I was actually doing the exact opposite. So when they said push, I was doing nothing. I was doing absolutely nothing. I was just relaxing. And then when they said, actually, no, when they said push, I was actually clenching. And then when they said hold it, I was doing absolutely nothing. Because I didn't know how to actually hold it. So the biometric feedback therapy is a way to train the bowel, to train your muscles so that you can reassociate performing the correct movements with, the correct context. So how that happened is like I would just go into this clinic and they would have this little monitor and they attach these electrodes to your bottom, and the monitor, I would just play a little game, and the game is like maybe they've updated the game to have better graphics or something by now, but like there's just like little 8-bit, these green cliffs, and then there's like a river, and then I'm controlling a ship. And then it's the game is wired so that when I'm clenching or when I'm like trying to hold it, the ship would stay in the middle. And when I relax, the ship would like drift off to the sides. So the game would be like the cliffs would expand and, narrow and expand. And I'd have these like try to navigate the cliffs so that, it doesn't hit or try to navigate the ship so that it doesn't hit the sides of the cliffs. So through that, I actually learned how to like prevent myself from just like relaxing completely. And once I learned that, changed like basically a lot of things for me. Like in terms of going to the bathroom, I wouldn't sit there for an hour. I would still be going to the bathroom frequently, but it would also end frequently because I knew how to like actually push it out and finish it. And as a consequence of that, like I would also not, be like backed up or anything throughout the rest of the day. And then also if I had to go to the bathroom throughout the rest of the day, I could hold it and fight against it, even though it was very difficult. Like I could still do it and then find ways to, go to the bathroom later at a more appropriate time. So that's, definitely the thing that helped me the most.
Great. Thanks, Justin, for elaborating on that. We have several more participants who have joined. Welcome to everybody. I want to invite you all to post your questions in the chat if you have them. If you don't have access to chat, I'm trying to think. I'm not sure how I can really get your questions. So, Justin, you're talking about the biometric feedback and the difference it made for you in bowel control.
Yes.
Maybe changing a little bit of the topic to some of the social dimensions of your living with Hirschsprung. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like how you navigated that and some of the challenges you faced?
Yeah, definitely. Again, I think given my situation, I don't know if everyone is going to have similar things, but just from what I've read online, I realized that there's a lot of shared experience in Hirschsprungs disease, whether you experience it one way or the other. So I think because I was lucky enough to be able to like even attempt to hide my condition, that's how I coped with my condition. So basically, from when I was a child up until like high school, I never told a single person about my condition, and I just made my best attempt to hide it in school, even though I would have accidents like fairly frequently. But the thing is, I think kids are just really resilient and probably smarter than you might give them credit for. And I just became really, really good at hiding it. To the point that like in all that time, even though I was having accidents fairly frequently, I don't think anyone ever brought it up with me. I can count the number of times like a teacher or a student. I don't think a student ever talked to me about it, actually, but I can like maybe like twice, even though it was happening, fairly frequently, that someone would actually talk to me about. And it's possible that maybe all my friends knew about it, but they just never told me. But considering kids generally talk about everything, maybe I don't know if that was the case. But yeah, so I think the way I dealt with it was I just became very good at understanding like when, like if something was happening to me, like trying to blend into the background like as seamlessly as possible, trying to not call attention to myself, and then finding an empty bathroom and cleaning myself and things like that. And that was like very normal to me, and to the extent that if no one noticed that that was happening, I did not worry about it at all. Like I kind of like pushed away all the consequences of, like I was very, very afraid that someone would notice it, but because I was doing it every day and I was like becoming very familiar with the situation, like I was like very fine with just hiding it completely and not talking about it and not worrying about that. And I don't think I ever communicated that with my parents, because it's a very difficult and weird thing to conceptualize. Like when I went home after the day, I wouldn't think anything was wrong because it was just happening all the time. And for my parents, like another thing that I wanted to mention was, like, I think clinically or scientifically, by all metrics from my parents, I was doing completely fine. Like I was getting good grades and I had plenty of friends. It's not like I was getting bullied. I had any problem, talking with people necessarily. But it's just, this was happening every day. And they didn't know that I was necessarily going through this process of, hiding myself. And for my parents, I think for my mom especially, she was just very confused. Like she's just like, why is this still happening? And
when you say this, you mean sort of soiling?
Yeah.
And okay.
Yeah, because like by all, no, totally fine. By all other metrics, things seemed fine because I became so good at just like pretending like nothing was happening at school. But I think internally, and I think this is another thing that a lot of kids with Hirschsprungs disease struggle with. I was extremely terrified at going out of my comfort zone because I had mastered, the things that I was familiar with so well. And like going out of my comfort zone meant maybe like getting found out, getting, called out and, things like that. So this idea of like going out of my comfort zone is like probably something that as I grew up, it definitely stayed with me, even if the condition, like the disease conditions changed. Like going out of my comfort zone and just so for a lot of patients with Hirschsprungs disease, like they might grow up feeling very shy, like it's difficult for them to socialize with people, and have like body image issues. I think it's like a very similar thing with me. It's just I became very, very comfortable with like mastering my situation and not worrying about anything else. Like as long as I can like make it through the day and no one knows about what happened, it's fine. And I don't have to, think about it after that.
It sounds like you live the disease almost in several different dimensions. There's the physical dimension, the psychological dimension, which you were just describing, the family and social dimension. If you had to sort of rank the degree of difficulty in those different situations, what was the
Yeah.
hardest?
That's a good question. I think so. Like physically, there would definitely be physical ramifications, and that's what I think my parents were the most concerned about, because I didn't seem to have any problems to them, mentally, socially, or anything. But I would come back, especially on like days that were bad, with like quite severe rashes and like a lot of just pain. I would have trouble walking and things like that, because I would just be like, that was like the cost that I paid with hiding hiding soiling or hiding accidents and things like that. And they
So
were
in
just
other words, just for the audience,
Yeah.
and it's inevitable with HD. We kind of have to be graphic, but it is what it is. So you were experiencing abdominal cramps because you weren't letting out gas, because you just were retaining.
Yeah.
Is that what I'm?
Well,
is
actually,
that what you mean?
no, because I couldn't retain it, right?
I see.
But actually, the thing that was happening to me was like I would like soiling would occur, but I think like if you think of like an adult person who experiences that, they would just like go to the bathroom or something, and then like that wouldn't be an issue.
Sure.
But as a kid, if you're like locked in this social classroom where like sometimes the teachers like impose like bathroom limits and things like that, or you feel like students around you are watching you, or you feel like you're getting judged, like the best way for me to deal with that was just pretend like absolutely nothing happened, and then like wait with it. And if you wait with it, that's what causes like rashes and like bleeding.
Yep.
So, and then like if depending on the extent, like sometimes that would happen multiple times in a day, right? And then that would like it would just be very painful the rest of the day. And then I think for my parents that was very difficult to understand. They would just be like, why is that happening? And it's very difficult as a kid to communicate to your parents that you're feeling the social pressure of like, I don't want to feel different from my friends, or I don't want my teachers to see me as like something like someone who's not in control. So I'm just gonna, sit there. It seems very odd to my parents. I don't think I never communicated with that with my mom or dad, because I just felt like they wouldn't understand it. I think now in hindsight, they probably would, but as a kid, it was definitely something that I knew was like, I knew that wasn't like a normal feeling, but it's just something I kept to myself because, I was good at dealing with it by myself. So I just did. And as long as I never faced the consequences of people, pointing it out to me, then I would just keep doing it. And I think without the biometric feedback therapy, I would probably, still have kept doing it.
So it sounds like you, as a young person, prioritize the social dimensions of the disease. That
Yes.
makes intuitive sense. So, our son Adrian is 17. He has Down syndrome and total colonic HD. So it's a completely different dynamic. And we've always, communicated with his teachers and school administrators right up front his condition. One of the reasons my wife Isabel and I, wrote a children's book was to be able to communicate with other people, so that they knew what was going on. But I can understand in a typical child where, you've got all these social sort of pressures or perceived pressures on you. You just want to fit in. And so not calling attention to yourself, you might even resist your parents' desire to do that.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's really interesting. We've got a number of attendees now on the call. I want to invite all of you to use the chat feature to ask questions of Justin. I'm not trying to monopolize this. Not surprisingly, we have a number of women. I'm sure you're mothers of kids with HD. Thanks for joining. Justin, what advice would you have today for your parents then in how to make your journey easier, smoother? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think just something that I would want to emphasize that my parents probably didn't know then is that as a kid, I was definitely thinking about all these things, but I was not projecting any of that on the surface because I just became very comfortable with, like, I knew if I shared some of these things that it would bring attention to it. And I didn't want to bring attention to that part of myself. So I think the knowledge that your kid or child is probably experiencing these things growing up, and understanding that, having an open mind, and uh, you know, being willing to listen about that is definitely a good thing. To give my parents full credit, I don't blame my parents at all for anything. I think they did a terrific job. It's just, if you're a parent and you don't know much about this disease, you're definitely not going to know anything that your kid is experiencing because it can be very internal. I think one thing that I think definitely would have helped me as a child is knowing that there are other people out there like me. I think in hindsight, that would have definitely been very helpful because, like, as a kid, it's very easy to think that, like, there's all this pressure around you and you're just navigating it yourself, and no one necessarily understands. But I think once I discovered that there were other people like me, and like when I read some of the reports, that some of the like the sentiments that I experienced were also experienced by other people, and they also navigated that. And there was I'm not navigating this completely on my own. That would have been extremely helpful, I think. And then I think another thing I just wanted to clarify is that my parents did communicate that with my teachers. Actually, they communicated that I had a condition with my teachers, but they didn't communicate that to me. Like, they didn't communicate that. Yes, they didn't communicate that my teachers necessarily knew about my condition to me either. So I thought it was something to hide from my teachers as well. Even though, like, if something happened, my teachers probably would have been very understanding. But from from my perspective, I would be, very embarrassed. I would be, I would not feel good. And I didn't want my teachers to see me as, like, someone who couldn't control, themselves, someone who was like a child, or like, very infantilized and things like that. I think one of the things is also that the words that you use can have a significant effect. The one thing I remember is, like, in the communication between my parents and teachers, is that like, for, like, when I think this was when I was, like, in second grade or something, and kids are just kids, they cause mischief and things like that. So we were just, like, reading over the like the enrollment sheet, and then there were, like, some special needs, like, lists, and we were just like looking over the descriptions of the special needs lists. And then from all of them, they were, like, completely normal. And then I think for my description, which I still remember, like, my friends were reading and it said, "Please let Justin go to the bathroom, otherwise he will have accidents." And then I remember reading that, and I remember my friends reading that, and I was feeling like it sounded very childish, right? Like, and I did not want to feel like I was a child, right? And I think the language around which you can communicate that condition can have an effect on how, like, your child views that condition as well. And that's something I still remember to this day. I don't think it's, like, necessarily something that traumatized me necessarily, but it's something that I remember, like, I saw that was, like, one of the few times that my friends saw anything about my condition, and I felt like I really didn't like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So a couple of things you've highlighted around communication, the care with which parents communicate their child's condition with the school, and the impact it may have on their peer relationships, I think is a great example. Communication with the child, him or herself. And then I think you also highlighted that parents should really assume that their children have a pretty rich experience. I mean, this is obvious, a rich experience of the disease, and want to talk about that openly. I think, or a couple of things I took away from that segment.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think for me as a kid, I was so used to hiding it actually that I would have needed a little bit of prompting definitely to like actually talk about the condition, to the point where like I would go to the doctor and they would say, is anything wrong? And I would say nothing's wrong. And then I think if I was like filling some sort of scientific survey or something, and they said, do you have any problems with your condition? Even though I was like having incidents every day because I was just compartmentalizing and coping with it in such a way, I would just say nothing's wrong, this is fine, because I didn't know that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't know that there's any alternative, and I was just managing with it. And in terms of my emotions around it, I was just, as long as nothing, like there's no consequences, I'm just dealing with it on my own. And well, my parents are also dealing with it, but as long as I'm just like internalizing all of that, it's okay. It's fine. I'm just going to keep dealing with that.
Great. We have a couple of questions. Thanks for submitting them, attendees. So first, Dawn asked, did you ever have to resort to an MACE or a MACE or cecostomy?
Given the fact that I don't know what those are, probably not.
Right. So I think a cecostomy is really something that is inserted into the ileum or what's left of the colon, I believe, to flush. Sometimes it's called, I think, an anterior enema, but it doesn't sound like you had that. My experience with Hirschsprung kids is that kids with short segment rarely have cecostomy. We have another question from an attendee, and he writes, my son will almost certainly not agree to participate in interventional biometric feedback. Do you think there's anything else that might teach him the same lessons? For example, some kind of a visual description of how to do it differently, videos, tutorials, anything you've heard of?
Yeah, I think, well, personally, I don't think I've heard of it, but I think the benefit of biometric feedback is, as a parent, definitely looking at your child, there's no real way of knowing like what they're trying, like if you're trying to describe to your kid how to push out stool, if they've never done it, like fundamentally it's very difficult to describe. It's like describing the colors to someone who can't see colors or something like that. It's just neurologically it's not there, so it just doesn't make sense. So I think the fact that the biometric feedback therapy allows you to directly connect your the stimulus that you're providing from your body to what is appearing on a screen can be very significant. As to whether your child will be willing to engage in that, I think one caveat is that I think biometric feedback therapy may not necessarily work for everyone as well, because I think you first have to have, it worked very well for me because it fulfilled multiple conditions in that I had the mechanics to be able to push out stool and recover bowel movements correctly. And I was also my problem was that I was doing it completely wrong. And depending on the initial assessment, that might not be the case for your child. I have no way of knowing, but
it doesn't sound like you've heard of any effective alternatives.
Yeah, I mean,
to it. Whether you practiced other alternatives before trying biometric feedback.
Yeah, so I think the thing for me is when I found out that I was doing it completely wrong, that was absolutely a shock to me. And I think that was also my parents had no idea that was happening. So once I connected those dots, it just everything made a lot more sense. But yeah, I think I wouldn't personally know about it, but I think there probably are alternative resources. If you just look along the lines of biometric feedback, I'm sure there's definitely branches of,
Cool.
yeah.
One more question came in recently about diet. And
Yeah.
the question is, did you have any specific dietary restrictions? Were you aware of foods that were particularly, activating for your condition?
Yeah, definitely. The common things are like fruits, sugar. I think that was mentioned in the question. Fruit, sugar,
Yeah.
like chocolate, and like milk. I think the milk might be, I'm just lactose intolerant, but other things like that was definitely super activator. The problem is I really like those foods. And also I think as a kid, like I think something that parents might understand is because we're very used to accidents like this happening, like I would still eat those foods. Like, and I think as a parent, it might be very difficult to communicate with your child that it's like maybe you shouldn't eat those foods because it'll give you this adverse reaction, right? But as a kid, if you're so familiar with the adverse reaction and you're familiar with coping with it, like I sometimes didn't necessarily see that as like a major consequence, and I would just eat it anyway, and then I would suffer the consequences after, right? But I think that can be something that it might be useful for parents to understand for their kids, right? Like if you're a parent, it might be a lot easier to see, your kid having like this reaction to these foods as like quite bad, but from the kid's perspective, it might not be the same. Now, as I'm older, it's definitely a lot more oily foods. And I think when I was talking to Dr. Goldstein before, he said that's, quite common, especially in older patients. So I think like the sugar and stuff has definitely subsided significantly. And now I would say it's like mostly just oily foods.
That you have to stay away from. You have ability to tolerate some of the foods that you couldn't tolerate as a younger person.
Yeah, I would say as an adult, I don't really stay away from foods really anymore, because I think as an adult, once you step away from the classroom, the social pressures and all of that regiment, and you like right now I live alone, I have my own bathroom and things like that. Or like when you go to college, and like the entire atmosphere becomes a lot more free. No one's watching you all the time, right? So it's like and also because I've also gained, a lot better control over my symptoms compared to as a kid. Like I can eat something, realize I might experience something afterwards, and then, just go to the bathroom like a normal person. And even if I'm going to the bathroom fairly frequently, like 3 to 5 times a day or something like that, like I'm not too stressed out about it because, I just deal with it like a normal person.
Great.
Yeah.
So we have another great question or observation from an attendee. I'm just going to read it. We've had a hard time finding families and children for our son to connect to. And at this point, he's dealing with such significant social anxiety and embarrassment around the topic.
Yeah.
I'm not sure he'd be receptive. However, thoughts on how to make those connections?
I definitely think it depends on the connections, like who like those connections are to. Like I think child to parent and child to peer and child to like teacher are definitely significantly different. I think even now, like the social pressure I felt from like my teachers is like I was very comfortable with my friends and my parents, but like talking with other adults, sometimes I'm not super comfortable with actually. But as for how to navigate like creating those first social interaction, I think the main thing to understand about kids with Hirschsprungs disease is this concept of comfort zone, and the fear that comes with going out of it. So for me, because I had the ability to hide my condition, my comfort zone was I could make those social connections as long as I was able to, like I knew my atmosphere well enough to hide my conditions. So I think the idea of like expanding comfort zone, introducing these connections in a continual setting that they're familiar with, things that are new are very terrifying, or have always been, or were very terrifying for me. So like having like prolonged interactions, I think are very important. Like so that you can become comfortable with it on your own time, right? But like for a kid with Hirschsprung's disease, especially one that's like definitely struggling with like social interaction, like even like something that a parent might see as like a small step, for a kid might be like a very big step, right? So I think it's definitely about finding that balance, but like understanding the comfort zone and finding ways to expand it like very slowly and gradually is, probably my best piece of advice.
That's helpful. One clarification on your current condition, Justin. Someone is asking whether you're on any current medications.
Current medications, no.
I guess
I think
for HD. I mean, you don't have to share otherwise.
I think I was never actually on any medications, so I was lucky in that sense.
Okay. And then a follow-on question around the cecostomy and the MACE. I think that the attendees says, well, imagine if your parents had told you there was an alternative to having to defecate so frequently and maybe deal with soiling. Would that have been valuable for you to know? And might you have taken them up on that?
That's a good question. I think to give more insight into my experience as a kid is, as a kid, I would have said, I don't really care, because the only thing I cared about was like controlling, what I had. So if they said, you can do this thing, how does that sound to you? I'd be like, sure, if it doesn't like ruin the circumstances that I'm dealing with right now. Like as long as I have control and things like that, I'm fine with it. And the same thing is like why, if my doctor would be like, are you having any issues? I would say I have no issues, right? Like my current circumstances, I wouldn't think, oh, these need to be improved now, right? So I wasn't like actively searching for like a therapy or treatment or things like that. So if my parents said there is a therapy or treatment, I'd be like, okay. And I would probably just, my parents would probably have to push that or like get the ball rolling. And then, but like my initial reaction would just be like, okay, I wouldn't be, super excited about it probably, but that's just me.
That makes sense. I mean, you alluded to sort of the aversion to change that you recall having, and that's a general thing for people, of course. And then also, I think the parent would have to frame it in such a way. Here's what I hear you saying, by the way, Justin. I'm not sure I got it right.
Yeah, go for it.
Would have to frame it in a way that you could understand how things would be different.
Yeah.
And that would, in the first place, require them to know how you were currently experiencing the disease, which wasn't your case. So it's a very complicated question for you to answer. But I'm hoping that I'm giving this the right approach for the person who submitted the question, because I think it's a great question.
I think it's a great question.
So there was, in the previous question about connecting with, and making your own community, I think there's a follow-on to that, which I'd like to share. I think the intention was to ask the question in the context of if you could have made connections with other kids with HD, would that have been useful and helpful?
I
think community.
Yeah, I think that would have been definitely extremely useful. But I think for me, less the extent. I mean, probably having friends with like Hirschsprung's disease would have done a lot to like process my condition and erase like stigma around like what I was experiencing, how I was dealing with it, and like understanding ways or like different ways that have been already tried, right? Like I think for someone in my condition, like having knowledge of how things are going to work out was very, very valuable and important, right? So if other people had, that same knowledge, I would be more willing to, try their way or, experience other things. Or like if they had reassurance, like, oh, they did this and then it worked out and then, they went on to do other things, that would have been very comforting for me. Rather, like as a kid with all the unknowns, I would just like hunker down and be like, do what I can that I know is going to work and just not worry about anything else. So I think that definitely would have been very valuable. And I think possibly to my like broader claim, I think having that network of adults or like people that you can see went further and like have lived with the disease for like years doing different valuable careers, I think can also be very valuable. Just like for me as a kid, I definitely did not see myself in anyone in the future because like they didn't have the same condition that I had, or they were just different, right? But if I saw someone that was like, innately very much like me with this condition, and they're doing something cool, they're doing something that I want to do, that would be extremely inspiring.
Yeah, and I think in conversations with you prior to this coffee conversation, Justin, you made a very important point about that, and I think that role modeling is so important for young people, and the fact, frankly, that you are doing this with us, we really appreciate, because it really shows what's possible and gets out in the open some of these very challenging physical and social issues that kids with HD go through. So again, want to thank you and laud you for sharing your story.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing that also. You're seeing that on the chat, from the attendees, which is wonderful. Let's see. I'm going to just check out a couple of these additional questions. So here's one. Do you recall if your most helpful treatment came as part of a motility clinic specialist care, referencing places like that may offer bowel management programs?
Yeah, to be honest, I wouldn't be aware of that. I mean, my parents might be, but I think how my parents got into the biofeedback therapy was, I think it was kind of also lucky. Like the clinician that I was seeing knew about this like trial that they were doing. No, I don't know if it was necessarily a trial, but they referenced us to this the biometric feedback therapy program that was being performed, but she wasn't directly related to it. She was just like, oh, I heard that there's this thing going on at Stanford that could be pretty useful for you. So I think we kind of lucked out by that. But I think the fact that just like knowing that this option exists could be quite valuable for some people. So
that's great. I want to fast forward a little bit to adolescence, which is a difficult time for all young people.
Yeah, definitely.
Even those that are considered physically typical. Do you recall any specific challenges that you encountered during your adolescence, or was it sort of continuous with your social experience up to that point?
I think the thing with adolescence that I would say, I mean, this might not be specific to Hirschsprungs disease, as you mentioned, but like I was always like a pretty high achieving kid and like high achieving student, but I think I struggled a lot with with growing up and like ambition and career and things like that, because those were huge unknowns to me, and like the fear of going out of your comfort zone, experiencing things that you don't have control over were very, very scary. So I think like as a kid and teen, the only thing I wanted to be was normal. And I think like relative to a lot of my peers in high school that, had the same like performance that I did, they definitely didn't have that same sentiment. Like they wanted to be, I don't know, like they wanted to run companies and, create, like win Nobel Prizes and like become politicians or things like that. And the only thing I ever wanted to be was I just want to be normal. I want to, like not deal with any of the anxiety that comes with, being unknown. So I think like that fear of in adolescence and going on into adulthood was something that I definitely struggled with significantly. I think that is like somewhat a product of my struggles with Hirschsprung's disease. But I'm sure like a lot of other teenagers go through that in general. And I think the thing that actually helped me quite a bit in finding like that path and like why I'm here now is understanding my disease. Like as I mentioned before, I didn't really process the fact that I had a congenital condition, that I was like fighting against these things like my entire childhood until I was like 18 years old and like applying for college. And I was like, what am I doing? I've like, the only thing I had focused on up till then was like, hit the thing that's directly in front of you, like try to do it as best I can, and then go on. I wasn't thinking about the future at all because it just terrified. But I think once I processed the fact that I had this condition and the fact that these science and medicine helped me, it saved my life, it restored my function, and like through these methods, I can actually help other people. It gave me quite a bit of direction because like that feeling of as a kid, being scared, being ashamed, being embarrassed, or like being like fearful of, the things that are happening to you when you have no control over them, that has always been like a very powerful feeling to me. So if like, through the work that I'm doing, I can possibly take that, like alleviate that for some people, that just gave me like a lot more direction and kind of like really helped me alleviate the fear of, growing up. Because I think just like that direction was, or having a purpose in general has always been like extremely helpful for me.
That's great, Justin. That's really helpful. At a practical level, there's another question here about this from a parent with a child who's only 2 now, but sort of anticipating the socialization of their child. Did you feel comfortable going to other people's houses for play dates when you were young? Mm-hmm. Did you participate in sports? Was that available to you? Maybe share some of the practicalities of living with the disease with this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think in terms of going to people's houses, that was fine. Yeah, I think I was just considered myself pretty lucky in the fact that like it would kind of be sporadic to the point of, especially as I got older, like sometimes I would just have really bad days and then some days would be, okay. So if I was like going to someone's house or something, I would kind of just trust that, maybe it'd be an okay day and I'd be fine with that. In terms of sports, yeah, I was always like a very like played a lot of sports growing up. But I think the thing with Hirschsprung's disease that possibly, hindered me a bit was that it also made me a little bit afraid of going out of my comfort zone in terms of sports. Like I intrinsically enjoyed the sports, like doing the activities a lot, and I would just do it on my own. Like I think going in like before high school, I just like played basketball like 6 hours a day every day, and then I joined the high school team in basketball when I went to high school. But like I think the social aspect of like the sports was something that like I was very uncomfortable with when I was younger. Like I would play the sports by myself all day, but then once I like had to like join a regimented activity, like sports, practices and things like that, that would be something I would be a lot less comfortable with. So I think that's
yeah. Great. Sorry to interrupt, Justin. Go ahead.
Go for it. No, you go for it. Yeah.
I'm trying to conduct my own little thought experiment here about how tolerance from other kids would affect the experience of the child with HD.
Oh yeah,
or any congenital disease and or condition. And I'm just trying to imagine that you had a group of friends and you were able to open up to them and say, hey, this is what I got. it's just part of me.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not sure young people could
Yeah.
actually navigate that conversation, but I'm wondering. You're a lot closer to being a kid than I am,
Yeah.
and you certainly live with the disease. But I'm just wondering if that could have worked, and what were the risks? And did you ever actually consider that? I think the answer is probably
Yeah.
no, because
The
you
answer
didn't
is
really
no. Yeah.
consider you were different. But anyway,
Yeah.
over to you.
Yeah. I think, yeah, that's definitely a good question. I think the thing that I was definitely in fear of was the idea that they would see that I had this condition, and then I would like get made fun of, or be not even get made fun of, or they would like see me as something different or not normal, things like that. So the idea of doing that, like both because I didn't really process what was going on, but also like the fear of those unknown consequences was, definitely something that I was not comfortable with.
Right. In other words, the risk probably outweighed the reward.
Yes. Yes. I know, like, from reading some stories about Hirschsprungs disease, like sometimes like kids will overhear their parents like telling other parents that, oh, like my kid has Hirschsprungs disease, and they'll like feel really embarrassed about it or something like that. And I think it is actually quite, it's probably very important to the child that they have control over who knows, like, that's like, to me now, like I also think like that's very, significant, and it definitely gives a whole semblance of control that is probably very important to a Hirschsprung's disease kid.
Great. That's I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a really important point, I think, for us as parents to understand. So we have another comment here, just talking about the benefits of nightly large enemas that some bowel management clinicians and programs promote, and how transformative it's been in controlling accidents. I'm sharing this not so much with you, Justin, as for the other attendees on the call to be aware of, because we're all just trying to navigate this disease ourselves as parents, and for our kids, of course. Great. So I want to again invite callers or attendees on the webinar to share questions. This has been so informative, Justin. To me, I think one of the just huge takeaways is the disproportionate importance of the social dimensions to the condition for the kids living with it. It seems obvious to you, of course, but as parents, you can't help but being biased towards the physical well-being of our kids. Of course, mental well-being is key, but the social dimension is just really, you're bringing it to the fore, and I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. I think the way we're wired also, just as people, like if you have a physical thing that you're dealing with every day, it kind of eventually stops becoming like so important. But like the social thing and navigating pressures and things like that, those, especially as growing kids, growing adults, that like so many new things are happening. That's definitely was at the forefront of my mind for sure. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what's the implication of that?
I think the interesting thing about Hirschsprung's disease is that, like, especially, growing up, why it might be difficult to process for a lot of kids is that it's kind of different from a lot of other congenital conditions, right? Like in the context of like congenital heart disease or something, like that, the morbidity of congenital heart disease might be significantly higher. You face physical symptoms that might be a lot, scarier in terms of like your actual life or things like that, or in terms of physical congenital conditions where like it's very apparent upon seeing someone that they have this condition. But if you're a kid who has a condition which affects something that most people hide already, and it's not affecting you necessarily physically, it's not endangering your life, but it does have these implications in like how you navigate yourself. Like that in itself can be very difficult to understand and process. And I think like it definitely takes a lot of like growing up with a disease to help understand that. And I think for parents, it's also very difficult to like understand your children. Even for kids without Hirschsprung's disease, like a parent without a kid, you're drawing on your own experience. But if your kid has Hirschsprung's disease, it's very difficult to understand what they're going through. So, just the newness and the experience like socially, I think it's just far, like for me, it was far and away like the biggest impact.
And I don't think you went to a therapist or any kind of psychologist. In retrospect, do you think that would have been helpful to you? And what recommendations can you make around that topic to the parents here?
I think as a kid, and also my parents never would have thought of doing that, because as a kid, like I seemed totally fine. And as a kid, I probably would not be very comfortable opening up about that, because again, as I mentioned before, I was just dealing with it all. But I think the thing is, as a kid, seeing stories of people who grew up, or seeing stories of people like you that have similar experiences, is what helps a lot in terms of processing that information. Like even if you're talking to a therapist, the therapist isn't necessarily going to, understand the things that you're going through. I feel like seeing other people be like, I went through this, I felt these experiences, that's like more validating than any therapist just saying, this is normal, because like, how would they know, basically? So that's why I think like sharing these stories is like just very, very important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another, shout out opportunity to create a support group for young folks with HD, and just where they can meet, congregate. Although there's risk associated with that too, right? So
yeah, definitely.
Not sure how well attended it would be.
Yeah. I do think like the reason why I wanted to do this in the first place is that like whether there's like a present audience or not, the fact that you're putting out information that when they're ready to see it, or when they want to see it or looking to see it, it's there, easily accessible. That is quite important as well. Like even for me looking online now, there's not a lot of information or like stories and things like that that is either relatable or readily accessible. So having things like that like if you're a kid, you see the story without having to like go super, take a lot of effort to find, can be really important.
Great point. Yeah. One additional sort of question for you, which you'll see in the Q&A. If you're open to sharing, did you have any concerns with nighttime bedwetting prior to the biometric feedback period?
Yeah, I don't think I had any issues with bedwetting. I did have issues with like, having accidents when I was sleeping, but not like, it was, strictly of the not
poop
your
kind.
Yeah.
We're all really comfortable talking about poop in this community.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, Justin, it's we're an hour and 15 minutes into it. There are no open questions. You've been absolutely amazing in sharing your story and really helping us as parents get into the mind of a young person dealing with HD. I really can't thank you enough for sharing your story. I know we're going to be drawing on your experience and your expertise going forward, but I just want to thank you on behalf of all the attendees.
Yeah.
And on behalf of Reach.
Yeah. Are we out of time, or I think I might have had one more like.
Oh no, we've got time.
Yeah.
If you're inclined, fire away.
I think one thing about Hirschsprung's disease that might be a little counterintuitive, and again, also just my experience, so I don't want to impose my experience on other people, is that like actually growing up with Hirschsprung's disease, also I feel like it gave me a couple of superpowers. I think that
by all means, I didn't want to cut you off from sharing those.
Yeah. I've definitely like as an adult, I've come to appreciate, like I definitely think growing up with these, the things that I went through helped me now. And I think, other than Hirschsprung's disease, kids and parents might feel the same way. One of the things I see that's echoed a lot is just this understanding of other people and understanding that people have different circumstances and being open-minded to them. And I think in my case, I think my patience with people is like infinite. I think I have like a superhuman patience with people because I just understand that, like, as a kid, I just really wanted people to be patient with me and understanding, like, the anxiety that comes around like not fulfilling people's expectations and things like that. And so just in general, I think like my level of understanding for how people feel, like empathy and patience is, quite high. I think in terms of my, I've realized from like looking back on my experiences that I've really had quite a bit of resilience in terms of like the thing, like something that a lot of people take for granted every day is something that I definitely had to fight for, like both physically, mentally, and socially. And now that I've like definitely gained a lot of control over it, I realized that, as long as I try to do something, even though it's definitely hard and still a lot of things are quite hard, if I put my mind to it, I can, actually accomplish it. And then another thing is something that some people, I think when people think about like introversion, and a lot of people that grow up with disease might grow up being introverted, is that some people think of introversion as being an inherently bad thing, like, oh, you're not able to, be socially competent or something like that. But I don't think that's the case. In my case, like Hirschsprung's disease definitely contributed to me being introverted, but like introversion for me is like also a strength in that I'm like hyper intrinsically self-motivated. Like I told you before, I would play basketball for like 6-7 hours a day on my own, just like shooting free throws like for 3 hours straight or something like that, because I enjoyed like the control it brought me, but also like being alone, developing all these skills so that when I did interact with people, I had, all this stuff to draw on. And I think that's also a strength. And now in my PhD, where I'm doing research, independent research and things like that, I think that's definitely given me the skills to just be like, I can do it. I can develop it on my own. I can, do all of these things. And it's, definitely given me a sense of capability that I think if I, hadn't had Hirschsprung's disease, I might not have had.
I'm so glad, Justin, you highlighted those things. I know as a parent, and I'm sure others on this call, we want our kids to thrive, and who wouldn't want to raise children that are patient, empathetic, resilient, and have reservoirs of, inner strength. There's no doubt in my mind that, kids and parents of kids with HD are warriors. And I think you've just sort of made the case for, there is a flip side to the challenges that we know you experienced, and we all know our kids are experiencing. So that's a fantastic way to wrap this up. We do have one more question.
Oh yeah.
So Don mentions that her son has a book about a kid with HD, and he takes it to school each year for the teacher to read for understanding and acceptance from peers. He's 7. Do you think that helps or is more embarrassing for him?
Yeah, I think if the child is doing that of his own accord, then I'm sure that is helping him, because the child is probably not going to do something that, impacts him negatively. But I think if this is like something he's being forced to do, that might, be a different story. But I think it's generally probably a good sign in terms of what your kid is comfortable with and how that affects social pressures and things like that, if this is something they're actively trying to do. Because probably from the kid's perspective, they're going to do everything they can to, integrate themselves socially and be better received by their peers. So if, that's what they want to do, that's great.
Great. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Justin, this was such a pleasure to talk to you again and to bring your experience and frankly, your wisdom and your achievements to this group. I'm going to just give you a big clap, round of applause here.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic work. I want to thank all the attendees for joining, and I hope everybody has a great weekend and happy and healthy Thanksgiving and holidays coming up.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
That's a wrap. Bye for now, everybody.
Great, thank you.